Well, good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing this afternoon? Well, that is good. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. Um, and Caitlin Clark, of course, is returning for this presentation of hardship and survival among the Nimipu. This presentation is a closer look at Lewis and Clark's arrival in Nez Perce lands. The Nez Perce have played a profound role in the history of the United States, and Kate is here to share their important history. Kate is Executive Director of the Mercer County Historical Society in Salina, Ohio, and the Administrative Director of the Garst Museum in Greenville, and a recent inductee into the Daughters of the American Revolution, and is working her way to having her master's from Harvard. I would ask you to please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Kate Clark back to Orchestra Hall.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you ever so much for taking the time today to learn a little bit about the Nimipu with me today. You may know them better as the Nez Perce. They were a well-known tribe when they contacted the Lewis and Clark expedition. So a little bit of background on what we're going to be talking about today. So when it comes to Lewis and Clark are best known for their interactions with the two tribes that they named forts after. Those would be the Mandan, which we explored earlier today, and the Clatsop Native Americans far out near the Pacific Ocean. But there was a third tribe that perhaps contributed even more to the success of the expedition than perhaps any other tribe, and that would be the Nimipu. You see, you have the Clatsop, which would be the namesake of Fort Clatsop, and the Mandan, which were the namesake of Fort Mandan. But often we forget about the Nez Perce, or the Nimipu. And they spent quite a bit of time with the Nimipu. They, according to some historians, helped them more than any other tribe by means of saving them from starvation. They even kept their horses for Lewis and Clark when they were on their way to the Pacific, kept them until they came back for the return trip. Even more significantly, the Nimipu could have killed Lewis and Clark. We're going to be talking about that plot as well. They chose ultimately, obviously, not to do so. They even taught them how to build canoes in a more efficient means. When Lewis and Clark came into contact with the Nimipu, they were on the verge of severe starvation, very weak, also in possession of a lot of very interesting guns and other trade items that the Nimipu would have benefited from quite a bit. It made sense for the Nimipu to kill them and take these goods, and it would not have been hard. We're going to talk a little bit more about why that didn't happen very shortly. Of course, the Nimipu perspective of Lewis and Clark is quite a bit different than the perspective that we get of them from Lewis and Clark. According to Nez Perce tribal chairman Silas Whitman, he wrote this in 2013, he said that to the Nez Perce, Lewis and Clark were spiritually disconnected. In essence, they were walking dead people to the Nimipu, who are very, very spiritually connected. And they did not perceive that from Lewis and Clark and the men of the expedition. Regardless, they still made brothers of Lewis and Clark and, in turn, the United States government. May 11th through 12th, 1806, the Nez Perce and the United States became official allies by way of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And it's important to note that the Nimipu, for their sake, they never violated the treaty. They never broke that alliance. It was always going to be the United States government that renegotiated that alliance over and over again, usually in the government's favor. There was also a prophecy among the Nimipu that had actually foretold the arrival of Lewis and Clark among them. You see, they reviewed their prophecies, and it said that beings would come and would claim their land, would point at things and say, "That is mine. That is mine as well." And the Nimipu had known about this prophecy for years, centuries even. And they had not yet decided what they were going to do when these beings finally appeared. And so when Lewis and Clark did appear, suffering the severe effects of starvation when they came out of the mountains, the Nimipu still had not decided what they were going to do should this prophecy come to fruition. But before we talk about those specifics, I do want to share the creation story with you first. I always try to share the creation story because it shows the foundational beliefs of the tribe and why they might have reacted to certain things the way that they did. And so, this story is told to us by Oliver Frank. Oliver Frank is a member of the Nimipu tribe, and he was actually raised by Chief Joseph's sister, Deborah Corbett. According to Frank, there was Creator. The Creator made this land for all of the animal people. And he gathered these animal people into a council, and he told them that he wanted to create the humans. And so he said, choose 3 judges among yourselves, the animal people, and you will all decide who has what job. And so these animals gathered for a council, and any animal that showed up late was turned to stone. They did not get to be part of the council, and that will play a role later. So the animals decided among themselves how they were going to serve these people that the Creator wanted to create. The deer, they decided that they would live on the highest ridges, and that should they be hunted successfully, they would provide these new people, these new brothers and sisters, with their meat to eat and their hides to clothe themselves. The elk decided that they wanted to do the same thing, but the elk decided that they wanted to hide a little bit more effectively. They wanted to be harder for their human brother and sisters to harvest. The crows and the magpies decided that they wanted to be scavengers, and they wanted to help keep the earth clean for these new human brothers and sisters that were coming. So they made a pact with the insect people that they were going to help keep the earth clean. Eagle decided that he wanted to act as a brother and a guiding spirit to the people, as well as a mediator for all of their problems. He decided that his feathers were going to symbolize bravery and courage. And so it went, the animals choosing their jobs. Well, one animal showed up late, and he pled his case quite effectively. That animal was Coyote. Coyote showed up late, and Creator did not turn him to stone immediately. He wanted to hear why Coyote was late. And Coyote said that he wanted to be fierce. He wanted to be like the grizzly bear. But the grizzly had not showed up late. So the grizzly got to be fierce and terrifying. So Coyote said that he wanted to be like the eagle. Well, the eagle had not shown up late either. And so Coyote could not soar high above his new human brothers and sisters. But Creator did take pity on Coyote. Creator said that Coyote would be a world traveler, and that he would be the agent to all of the human beings. He would be their teacher. Coyote would be the one that the humans would laugh at. He would be silly. But Coyote would also be clever and strong in his own way. They said that Coyote, because he didn't get turned into stone, he would still only ever be one color. He would only ever be dull gray, like the stone he almost became. Then finally, Creator said that it would be Coyote's job, the most difficult job, to bring about the human people. And so, Coyote was building Celilo Falls, which unfortunately have been covered by rising waters now because of a dam that was put in place. But Coyote, according to Nimipu legend, created Celilo Falls that the salmon could jump up the river and could find the people on the other side of the falls. Well, a voice told Coyote that a great monster had come, and this monster had consumed all of the animal people. And of course, this would not do, because Coyote could not take care of the human people without his brothers and sisters, the other animal people. And so Coyote went to the monster and allowed himself to be consumed as well. And from inside the monster, Coyote cut away at the monster's heart until the heart started to die. The monster started to die, and as he did, Coyote chased all of his animal siblings out of the monster. And as they went, they also pushed the bones of the animal brothers and sisters that had not survived, being consumed by the monster. And so, Coyote and the animals and this pile of bones have made it outside of the monster. And Coyote told the animal people that had survived, gather the bones all together. And he sprinkled these bones with the monster's blood. Then, with Creator's permission, Coyote scattered these bones all across the world. And these bones that had once been his deceased brother and actually sprang to life. Coyote named them. He said, these will be the Cayusa. These will be the Flatheads, the Crow, the Blackfeet, the Sioux. They will be the Paiute. They will be the Ute, the Bannock, and the Shoshone. And then Coyote ate the monster himself. And when he was done, of course, only when he was done, Fox came forward and informed Coyote that he had forgotten the two important things. Coyote had forgotten to take care of himself, and Coyote had forgotten to create the people who would live in the Kamiah Valley. Coyote was very frustrated that Fox had waited to remind him at the very last minute. So Coyote told the other animal people, "Bring me a bowl of water," and they did. And Coyote washed his paws in the bowl of water, washed the blood from the monster in this bowl of water, and then he sprinkled this blood water on the land that was the Kamiah Valley. And people did spring up from this moment. And Coyote said to them, "You, the Namipu, may be the last to be blessed, but you shall and will be known to the human race as small but mighty." And of course, here, if you look at this picture, this, according to Namipu tradition, is the heart of the monster. This mound is where the heart of the monster lives. It was the only part that Coyote did not eat that day. And if you were to ask any Namipu tribe member, they would never say, according to my research, they would never claim to have crossed the Bering Strait. They have always been in the Kamiah River Valley. And there is actually evidence of truth to this. Because you see, when we look at Namipu creation stories, these creation stories account for things that if the Namipu had originally come from the Bering Strait, these stories would not exist. You see, the Namipu stories, they account tales of woolly mammoths and three-toed horses, animals that have gone extinct thousands of years ago. And not only that, but the Namipu have a creation story for Crater Lake, Oregon. How is this possible? They would have had to have been there for that, which means they would not have come across the Bering Strait. So there is arguable evidence that the Namipu have forever lived in the Kamiah River Valley. A little bit about their ways of life. So water held, and still does hold, serious significance to the Namipu traditionally and culturally. Water is the thread that holds everything together, and it would make perfect sense because they are a water-centered culture. The Snake River, the Clearwater, the Salmon, all of these rivers form the Namipu homeland. It's the center of their lives for centuries. And it was seen as being the ultimate medicine. Water could do anything. In fact, it, of course, grew plants as they knew. It soothed wounds. On top of that, it was drank at the beginning of every single day. And traditionally, it was drank before every single meal because spiritually, water cleansed the spirit. And so, they became a water-centered, water-focused culture, which would influence later on their help to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Food was gathered by both men and women. Men would hunt large game, but women were the ones that not only gathered root vegetables such as camas root, as well as spring roots of different kinds, but women were the ones that were in charge of preserving it. And so this helped with women's hierarchy within the tribe. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But being invited to dig roots as a young girl was a sign of coming of age. You could only dig roots with the older women if you had come of age. Sweat baths were also very important to the Namipu. It was a pit lined with special stones, and rocks were heated at a fire outside before being taken in and sat in the middle of this pit. This here is a picture that I took in 2019 when I went and I visited the Nez Perce Museum in Idaho. It was a wonderful experience. And if you can read up there, that's part of the story on the wall, the old man and the sweat lodge. Because see, once these rocks were brought in, heated from the fire outside, and they were put in this pit, the doorman would come in, and he would do something called washing the old man's face. He would throw water on these hot stones, and a burst of steam would come up. This burst of steam would be accompanied by the saying of prayers because it was believed that the steam would carry those prayers up, that they would be heard. When the last water dump came around, it was said to be in honor of the old man, because that was the personification of the sweat lodge. Following this, when the rocks stopped speaking, which means when they stopped creating fog or a mist, then the doorman would come to the door of the lodge and would howl like a coyote, and everyone would leave the sweat lodge and go jump into the nearest cold creek, because water was spiritually sacred. This was usually done about 3 times in quick succession, and the elders, during each speaking of the rocks, they would tell stories about the tribe's history. it's important to note that women and men did not share the same sweat lodges. They were in different lodges, but they still practiced this tradition. Cold water in particular was highly sought after when it came to Nimipu practices. One such reason was that children were required to bathe in cold water daily. It was seen as a toughening agent. They were so specific and dedicated to it that the children would go to a nearby creek and they would be required to submerge themselves over their shoulders. And an elder would stand on the bank, and any child that lifted their shoulders up out of the water would get switched around the shoulders until they dropped back down. It was a cultural norm, this appreciation of water, of course, as a water-centered culture. It would make sense. I touched on the social status of women and the connection with food. You've just heard the creation story, and it involves Coyote eating the monster and leaving only his heart. And so you could expect that many of the other stories important to the Nimipu culture involved eating and food. Food was a main priority in myths and legends among the Nimipu, and so it makes sense that those people of the tribe who were charged with preserving food would hold a special status. That would be women. Of course, when Lewis and Clark came among the Nimipu, they could not recognize this. They did not see it. They were not expecting it, and so they did not write it down. They did not appreciate the social status that women held within the Nimipu tribe, which it would be ultimately the social status of one woman that saved the expedition from annihilation, truly. And so one of my favorite stories, or collection of stories, is the arrival of the horse among the Nimipu. The Nimipu were known as excellent horsemen, but this was not always the case. You see, horses were released onto the southwestern plains about 1680 during what would become known as the Pueblo Revolt between the Pueblo Native Americans and the Spanish. So this released hundreds of horses onto the plains, and slowly those horses made their way north through trade. It's likely that the Nimipu received their first horses from their neighbors, the Shoshone, which were their enemies, which we'll talk about in a moment. The arrival of the horse created a cultural revolution for the Nimipu. They went from being a river and water-centered people to being entirely horse-centered in almost every single aspect of their lives. And this would have been about 1750 when this took place. Warfare completely changed within Nimipu culture because horses, they were used for warfare. They were fast-moving, they could travel further, they became badges of honor. The number of horses and the quality of horses you had boosted your social status after a war party returned. They even became dowry for marriage between Nimipu families. And hunting, it changed the hunting aspect for the Nimipu as well. They could hunt larger and faster game. They could go longer distances to hunt. And then they were able to haul back more food after a hunt. Horses completely changed every aspect, but perhaps most significantly, they changed the spiritual aspect of Nimipu culture. They became known as Weaken, or guardian spirits of the tribe, and the horses were thought to protect the tribe, and it linked them with the rest of not just the physical world, but the spiritual world. One of my favorite stories is the horse, or a horse with a heart of stone. This story told by, again, Harry Wheeler, who told us earlier about the other story. He tells the story of Suits Pilkin, who was a Nimipu man. He was invited to wrangle some broncos in Mexico. Well, while he was there, he stole 2 spotted mares and a spotted stallion from the Spaniards in Mexico, and he brought them back to the tribe. You see, the arrival of these horses had actually been prophesied by a dreamer prophet named Emat Sinpun, and Emat Sinpun had said that a horse would arrive among them that had the eyes of a brother. And you can tell very clearly from even just this horse here in the modern day. You can almost see exactly what this horse is thinking just by its eyes. And the Nimipu recognized this quality in these horses that were among them. And they would begin the process of creating what to us would be known as the Appaloosa horse. And so this next story is told by Pia Pia Talikt, or bird alighting, to his cousin many wounds. Pio Pio Talikt was a veteran of the War of 1877, and his father actually met Lewis and Clark when his father was a child. So this is one of the closest firsthand accounts from the Namipu perspective that we could get. So, many generations before Lewis and Clark, the Namipu decided that they needed a way to prophesy what was to come, and so they turned to the oldest thing they were aware of: rocks. Rocks are the oldest thing on earth, and so they listened to the rocks. And from the rocks, the Namipu claimed to learn that there would be a new being that would come. This new being would point at their land and their animals and their things, their rivers, their mountains, and it would say, "This is mine, that is mine, all of this is mine." These new beings would bring good things and they would bring bad things. And the Namipu had fought internally with what they were going to do when this prophecy came to be. Well, first contact between Lewis and Clark and the Namipu might have come about as early as their time during the stay at Fort Mandan. Allegedly, Chief Twisted Hair, who would play a major role in the expedition's success, allegedly went to Fort Mandan with Shoshone guides and was there. We don't know if this story is true. And so, officially, we recognize that Lewis and Clark encountered the Namipu September 10th, 1805, when one of the hunters, John Coulter, encountered 3 men and brought them back to Meriwether Lewis in the camp. But the more famous first contact was at the Weite Prairie. So the Weite Prairie was known as a root digging area. Villages were set up around the perimeter from different clans, different tribes. They would come, and during this time of year, they would all be digging for camas bulbs and other spring roots in the prairie. And so there were 3 boys, one by the name of Elia, and this was Chief Twisted Hair's 8-year-old son. Keep that name in mind, Elia, because eventually he would become the chief known as Chief Lawyer. Chief Lawyer eventually, but right now, he's just an 8-year-old boy with his 2 friends on the prairie, and he looks up and he sees men like he's never seen before. He described them as being pale with eyes like fish, eyes so pale that they looked like fish eyes. It was probably very terrifying for them to see these strangers coming out of the mountains, bedraggled, starving. It was William Clark and the forward part of the expedition, a small portion. The rest of the expedition was still in the mountains, moving a bit slower. Well, the boys hid, naturally, but William Clark found them, gave them bits of ribbon, and sent the boys to the village to tell the other tribe members of their arrival. Back at the village, Alwias was the brother of Twisted Hair, so Elia's uncle. Alwias, he greeted Clark at the village, but little did Clark know that while he and Twisted Hair's brother were talking, they were being surrounded by warriors with arrows drawn, because they had not yet decided what they were going to do when these new beings arrived among them. And so, Alwias took Clark and his men to his lodge, and he fed them pieces of dried buffalo, camas bread, all of these things because Lewis and Clark were starving. So he fed them, naturally. Well, because they were starving, this food did not settle well, and Clark and his men immediately became very, very ill, to the point that some of them could not stand up for days. Alwias, in the meantime, sent out word to all of the other tribes in the area that the time had come. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and now they needed to decide how they were going to react. It was time to make decisions. And so, they thought immediately about the obvious answer to this, and that is to kill Clark and his men. Lewis and Clark were well armed, as mentioned, and if the Namipu killed them, they would be rich. They would be set for generations if they took these guns and these trade items. Also, there was the problem of Sakakawea. You see, the Namipu and the Shoshone were generational enemies. And when they found out that she was Shoshone, it did not matter that she had a baby. It did not matter that she was a woman. In previous interactions with Native American tribes, Sakagowea's presence had been a peace offering. However, a Shoshone woman arriving among the Namipu was not peaceful. They took it as a sign of war. And not only that, but there was also the enslaved man of William Clark named York. And York was a black man. They believed that he was painted black, and therefore he represented another sign of war. So all of these things that had, until that point, helped Lewis and Clark were actually endangering the expedition very suddenly when it came to meeting the Namipu. On top of that, Clark and his men were seriously ill, and so the Namipu decided that they were going to wait because Clark had let slip that Lewis was still coming down out of the mountains with the main party. So the Namipu decided that when Lewis arrived, they were going to feed them the same food they'd fed Clark. They were going to wait for them to get sick and weak and more tired than they already were. And then they were going to kill them, dispose of their bodies so that no one would find them. That was the plan. However, Lewis arrives, and evidence of the reality of this plan was that Lewis made note in his journal that the Namipu women took their children up and fled into the woods. Lewis at the time did not know why this was. But now we know that it was because of this plot. The Namipu women thought that the massacre would commence immediately, and so they had taken their children into the woods to keep them safe. That is how close this call was when it came to the Lewis and Clark's expedition being completely decimated. But then we have a hero, an unexpected hero when it comes to Lewis and Clark. Watkawese. Her name means returned from a far country. She was captured as a child. She was a Namipu woman, very elderly by this point. But as a child, she'd been captured by Plains tribes, and she had been sold all the way to the Great Lakes, not too far from where we are now. She was married to a white man, and they had a child, and she said that he was very good to her, that the white people took pity on her. They fed her, they clothed her, they gave her medicine. Well, this white man decided that he wanted to go back to the East Coast, but Watkawese, whose name at the time was not Watkawese, she told him that she would not walk a single step further from her homeland. And so he left her, and she picked up her baby and started to walk all the way home to what is modern-day Idaho. Unfortunately, the baby did not survive the trip, and she buried the baby by herself in the mountains. But soon she was discovered by a hunting party of Salish, who were friends of the Namipu. They took her into their party, and they returned her to her people the very next spring. And so, by the year of 1805, Watkawese was actually on her deathbed when Lewis and Clark arrived in the Namipu camp. She was part of Chief Red Grizzly Bear's digging camp, and he was her relative. So not only was she a woman who had interacted with white people before, but she was a relative of a high-standing chief. So her social status was very significant. She was laying in her teepee, dying of old age, when she heard of the plans to kill a group of white men that had just arrived. It said that she stood, went outside, saw them, and shouted, "Do them no harm." At this time, the war chiefs of the Namipu were absent. They were they had gone for vengeance against another tribe, and so the two people there to make choices were Chief Twisted Hair and Watkawese. And so it was in this way that they decided to spare Lewis and Clark. In fact, they decided to become allies with them. They provided both Captains Lewis and Clark with horses, because at this point, Lewis had returned, had unfortunately eaten the food after a starvation diet, and was actually so sick that he could not mount a horse. And so, the Namipu would be helping them with almost every step of the journey when they were headed further along the Columbia River. And so, the trading commenced. Knives, peace medals, the American flag, all of these things changed hands, but perhaps one of the most consequential moments came when Lewis and Clark accidentally traded one of their shirts. It would not seem like such a thing of significance, but to the Namipu, the trading of shirts makes you brothers. And so Lewis and Clark traded their shirts with some Namipu, and so Lewis and Clark accidentally made themselves brothers of the tribe. They did not know this, nor would they benefit from this until much later. But as the Namipu continued to interact with Lewis and Clark, they noticed some very significant things. For instance, they noticed William Clark. They believed he had healing powers. They noticed his red hair, and they believed that he had a connection to the spirit world. And when they looked at Lewis, they noticed that he had martial prowess with a rifle. He was a very good marksman. And of course, that is also a status symbol within the Nimipu tradition. And so they believed him to also be a natural leader. So not only did they go from almost killing Lewis and Clark, but as time wore on and Lewis and Clark spent time with the tribe, they started to recognize that these men were not just allies, that they were natural leaders worthy of respect. Of course, the Nimipu, following the leaving of Lewis and Clark in 1806, they maintained their alliance with Lewis and Clark. They remained loyal to the Grand Council held in May of 1806. And Lewis and Clark, upon leaving, told them there would be new arrivals coming soon. And Lewis and Clark were right. It just wasn't the arrivals that Lewis and Clark thought would be arriving. Because after Lewis and Clark left, it was the Canadians that arrived first. And Canadians provided guns, as well as little sundries such as scissors and needles, things that they did need. And then came mountain men who had no affiliation really to any country. They had no alliance to any one. They intermarried with the Nimipu, and they also fought against the Blackfeet with the Nimipu as well. And then, of course, just a few short years after Lewis and Clark departed, the real complications started to catch up, started to threaten that alliance that Lewis and Clark had formed with the Nimipu. In 1813, a man by the name of John Clark, Clark spelled C-L-A-R-K-E, so not connected to William Clark. He was an American trader with John Jacob Astor's Fur Company, and he actually hanged a Nimipu man for a perceived theft. This could have been a misunderstanding. As we look at what happened to William Clark just a few years previous, you see William Clark got angry and wrote in his journal that the Nimipu were stealing tobacco from him. But what he didn't understand was the shirt ceremony. He had essentially made himself a brother of the tribe. And as a brother, as a family member, he was expected to share his tobacco. So, the Nimipu did not believe they were stealing. But to someone who does not understand the culture, that is how it was perceived. And this might have been another case of some misunderstanding like that. In 1829, pandemic hit the Lower Columbia, and it actually wiped out entire villages. This is where we start to learn that disease specifically is a spiritual battle for the Nimipu. In 1830, 2 youths were selected from the tribe, and they would be sent to the Red River School. This is a picture of the Red River School up in Canada. Those 2 youths would be Ellis and Pitt. Ellis, in particular, you will want to remember, he was the grandson of Red Grizzly Bear. If you remember him, he's the relative of Watkawis. And Ellis is also the son of Twisted Hair, just like Chief Lawyer would be. So Ellis is someone that would be of great consequence very, very soon, but not yet. Because you see, in 1831, Chief Red Grizzly Bear, he in desperation would call together a council of 4 men to go and find Lewis and Clark in St. Louis. Remember that shirt ceremony. The Nimipu viewed Lewis and Clark as powerful relatives who could help them. And not only that, but we learn from the Nimipu sources that Lewis and Clark did take a Bible with them on the expedition, and that it was Lewis who, translating through Sacagawea, possibly introduced the Nimipu to the Christian God. And so, the tribe had just been ravaged 2 years earlier by severe illness, pandemic, white man's illness, as they saw it, and they believed that all illness is spiritual. As such, they believe that a white man's illness can only be cured by a white man's religion. And so they went and they sought Lewis and Clark so that they could learn how to pray the Christian way, so they could get rid of this illness that was ravaging the tribe. They arrive in St. Louis and they look for Clark immediately because remember, they thought that Clark was a spiritual healer, that he had connection to the spirit world. And they do find William Clark. He is the superintendent of Indian Affairs in St. Louis. But they also find out that Meriwether Lewis has died in 1809, several years earlier. And these Nimipu visitors went into mourning. Remember, he was their brother because of the shirt ceremony. They viewed him as having died as a family member of the tribe. William Clark told the Nimipu, he sent them back to Nimipu lands, and he told them that he would send a man to teach them about the Bible and how they could pray and how they could deal with his illness. Unfortunately, we do not have any direct records because William Clark did not keep records of this meeting. And then came the experiment. Remember that young gentleman named Ellis, the son of Twisted Hair, the relative of Chief Red Grizzly and Watcawees? He was one of the two that went to the Red River School. Well, he returned as a young man. And by this time, he spoke fluent English, and he wanted to introduce European culture to the Namipu, and he actually founded a cattle ranch near Namipu lands. While Dr. Elijah White, he was a sub-Indian agent for the United States government to the Oregon Territory, and he recognized Ellis as the head chief of the Namipu. There are several problems with this. Of course, Dr. White's reasoning was sound. He thought, well, this man, he is Namipu, born Namipu. He speaks English. He could be the bridge between the two worlds. However, Ellis was not recognized as a chief among the Namipu. He did not earn any kind of leadership role through the theft of horses or through exploits at war. And so the traditional Namipu did not recognize him as having any authority. White's words were just that, words. Before this could be fully realized, Ellis would die of a measles outbreak along with 60 other Namipu in March 1848. And this resulted in a severe power vacuum within the Namipu, and it was right at the beginning of the breakout of the Cayusa War as well. It was a bad time for the Namipu not to have a leader, and so a natural leader rose to the occasion, none other than Chief Lawyer. Remember, Elijah, the son of Twisted Hair, who was the first to meet William Clark on the Weite Prairie. He becomes the leader of the Namipu, and he is the one that will have to deal with the Treaty of 1855. So the Treaty of 1855 was no more to the Namipu than a formal recognition of an alliance they had already made with Lewis and Clark. They believed themselves to have already been allies of the United States for the previous 49 years. But since they remembered Lewis and Clark fondly, they came and they did sign the treaty. The very first signer of the treaty was Chief Lawyer, the son of Twisted Hair. And in his speech, he opened his speech with talking about the positive experience they had with Lewis and Clark. He said, the Nez Perces held a big council, and they said, we will receive them well, and we will be friends. From that time to this, the Nez Perces have been friends to the Americans. We have never spilt a drop of your blood. And he went on to remind the United States government of the long-standing alliance that had never been broken on their end. He also talked about white law. Because you see, Chief Lawyer, had a chance to talk to Ellis before Ellis died, and Ellis gave him very straightforward advice. Ellis told Chief Lawyer, whenever the great chief of the Americans shall come into your country to give you laws, accept them. No questions asked. It showed the tribe's peaceful intentions to work alongside the United States government. And it was also a reminder of Ellis's authority that had been put in place by the United States government. It reminded the United States government that the Namipu had to be recognized as a sovereign nation by the United States. There were other signers as well, such as Flint Necklace, who Meriwether Lewis accidentally translated his name as Looking Glass in the journals, but he was there, and he was the second signer. There was also Tamutsu the Younger and Tamomokin, and they were actually young boys when the expedition came through their area, and they were in charge of keeping safe Lewis and Clark's horses during the winter of 1805 through 1806. So all of these signers, to some degree or another, had a direct connection to the Lewis and Clark expedition and had a positive memory of Lewis and Clark. There was one man there that was not a signer because he was not a chief, but they brought him anyway for a very special reason, and that was Daytime Smoker. He was brought to the treaty signing, and an artist was drawn there. In fact, the other signers pushed him forward and insist that he get his portrait done while they were there for the treaty. He was light-complexioned, and he was red-haired, and he had the name Panahua Utat, the Redhead. And the area pioneers called him Clark. But we will get back to Daytime Smoker soon. Next came the Steele Treaty. So in 1860, gold was discovered on the Namipu lands. Their homeland had been organized in 1855, but as a result of the discovery of gold, it was cut down by 90%. The bands refused to sign, but they were ignored. and Chief Lawyer tried to fight against this incursion onto his traditional homelands. But according to his great-granddaughter, Miley Lawyer, he was told to sign for the good of the people. It was straight coercion. Troops that were sent to protect the tribe were actually there to intimidate them into signing the Treaty of 1863, known as the Steele Treaty appropriately. And then the 1877 War. This is often referred to as the Nez Perce War, or Chief Joseph's War. However, the problem with this is that the Nimipu were not the aggressors of this war. The outbreak of it was pretty straightforward. June 17th, which is actually tomorrow, is the anniversary, 1877, Captain David Perry, he rode his riders toward a village in the Whitebird Canyon. 3 Nimipu men carrying a white flag rode out to meet him and see what his intentions were. Unfortunately, one of Captain Perry's men leveled his rifle and started to fire at these Nimipu who were holding a flag of truce. And that is what began the War of 1877. It was 11 engagements total. And the reality of it was that the Nimipu, the traditional Nimipu who had largely not converted to Christianity, took flight for 1,500 long miles. They were trying to make it to Canada, and with them, they had their only remaining wealth, 3,000 Appaloosa horses. So they're trying to make it to Canada, and Daytime Smoker, who was in his 70s at this time, fled as well. And they were pursued by thousands of American troops. Like I said, this was only a portion of the Nimipu tribe, primarily those who had not converted to Christianity and still wanted to practice traditional ways. This 1 year here, 1877, has largely started to define the Nimipu story. But it doesn't even have the right name, calling it the Nez Perce War. On top of that, Chief Joseph, the leader, the recognized leader of this band, was romanticized for his strategic prowess. Some people even referred to him as the Red Napoleon. But the reality is that this was a gross crime against the Nimipu tribe. In fact, what happened here was reminiscent of Thomas Jefferson's own extermination policies, because Andrew Jackson said that those policies were what inspired his genocidal conduct against the Native Americans. As if that's not bad enough, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler also made the comment that Andrew Jackson's policies, which were used during the 1877 war, inspired him to create concentration camps. That is just how dark the United States government got when handling Native American tribes during this era and for many years after. This kind of treatment of the Native American tribes was not what Lewis and Clark and the Nimipu leaders of 1806 had in mind. In fact, William Clark, when he was the chief Indian agent, he was seen as too humanitarian. He was far from perfect. But even he was seen as being too humanitarian, too gentle with the tribes. Maybe. There we go. We'll see. My battery's dying. And so, October of 1877, Chief Joseph and his band would surrender to the United States government 40 miles short of the Canadian government. And in one battle of those 11 engagements, they lost 900 Appaloosa horses. One engagement. Of the remaining 2,000 horses, 1,000 of them were sent to auction, and they were forced to be crossed with draft horses so that they would move more slowly, getting rid of that careful breeding that it had taken decades for the Nimipu to perfect. These perfect specimens. They were known at that time as the greatest horses on the plains, but not anymore. Those that did not sell were shot. Over a century of careful breeding was lost in a matter of days. These horses were known for their courage in battle, and they were so intimidating to the United States government that the United States government actually banned the Nimipu from owning them until 1991. That's how intimidated the United States government was by these Appaloosa horses. Following the surrender, many were sent to Fort Leavenworth, and many died and were buried there. And so, what was left of this band that had surrendered, they were moved to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. Survivors were sent there by rail. Daytime Smoker was among them, Clark's own son, as it has been shown. He died there around 1878 by starvation. And his daughter, Iltolkt, and her son became prisoners of war. In 1885, the remnants of the Namipu Nation that had surrendered in 1877 were loaded onto a train at 1:15 on a sunny afternoon, and they were finally taken back home. More died in the United States custody than actually fought against the United States government. Some of these in 1885 were children and had met Lewis and Clark in less than 100 years. Just 80 years earlier, the Namipu became a minority in their own homelands. So by 1895, following the Dawes Act in 1887, lands were opened to white settlement. The Dawes Act was posed as a protection for Native American tribes, but the reality of it was that it was a land grab. These parcels were pre-measured, and each parcel was given to a member of the Namipu. But this is convenient because any leftover parcels that were already pre-measured could be sold for white settlement. So truly, it did not benefit the tribe at all. But there is a bright spot in this. So in 1904, suffragists, women who wanted the right to vote, they started to gravitate towards Sacagawea's story. And even though Sacagawea was Shoshone and was a generational enemy of the Namipu were fond of her memory. Former Chief Timothy Tamutsu the Younger, who signed the Treaty of 1855, who cared for Lewis and Clark's horses, he had a daughter whom he named Jane. And it's possible that he gave her the name Jane because William Clark's nickname for Sacagawea was Janie. Well, this Jane of the Namipu decided that she wanted to meet the bird woman. And so according to Piupiotalikt, or bird alighting, it's said that in the 1850s, Jane of the Namipu went to the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming because she wanted to meet Sacagawea. To this day, we are not sure how or when Sacagawea died. It could have been in 1812 of putrid fever, or she could have lived to a ripe old age on the Wind River Reservation. According to Namipu tradition, though, she did live to a ripe old age. Jane of the Namipu met her, and they exchanged dresses, making them sisters. And reportedly, the dress that Sacagawea gave to Jane of the Namipu was the one that she wore during the Lewis and Clark expedition. According to tradition, anyway. I'm not sure that we will ever know for sure what her fate was. And so today, we have the Fisheries Department of the Nez Perce, and they work to save the salmon, because a lot of these species that the Namipu had relied on for generations have actually gone extinct. And this is a direct result of the dams that have been put in place. These dams are killing sockeye and chinook at devastating numbers, and so the Namipu have taken on the role of trying to protect these remaining species. The work continues within the tribe. And then you have the Appaloosa horse. In 1937, Francis Haynes, he was a historian and PhD student, he actually wrote The Appaloosa or Palouse Horse. And he talked not only about the horse's significance to Namipu culture, but the danger that it faced of going extinct. He was held on retainer by the Namipu as they did research for reparations against the United States government following the war, the 1877 war. And it was because of his article that the Appaloosa Horse Club was founded. And at this point in time, there are over 700,000 Appaloosa horses that have been registered with the horse club since its creation. The Appaloosa horse was effectively saved from extinction. And the club works closely, even to this day, with the Namipu tribe. There's also the creation of the Nez Perce horse, which is standard Appaloosa, is crossed with a Middle Eastern horse called the Akaltik. There are about 60 of these horses, and the Namipu tribe operates the Young Horsemen's Program, which trains youths in equine management. This picture here is one of my favorite pictures that I found. That's Amy Tilden. She's the great-grand-niece of Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce war fame. She's wearing a traditional dress that is said to have been worn by her aunt at the last big council between Chief Joseph and General Howard prior to the outbreak of the war. And she is riding on a Grand Champion Appaloosa by the name of Bonnie. And it is a registered Appaloosa. This, I believe, was taken about 1947. It's a postcard that I found. So thank you all very much for coming today and learning about the history of the Nimipu. I think it's important that we don't just look at the Nimipu and other tribes through the lens of the Europeans who perceived them. Because as I was studying for this, I realized that there were quite different perspectives of the Nimipu, of both of themselves and of Lewis and Clark, that if you just read the Lewis and Clark journals, you would never truly know the Nimipu perspective of what was to come and what their lives were like prior to European contact. So thank you so very much for taking the time today. Do we have any questions?
Is Nez Perce and Nimipu sort of synonymous?
Yes.
Okay.
So Nez Perce in French means pierce nose, and William Clark was actually part of the reason for the confusion, because the hand sign that was used, well, the hand sign, there's Plains Indian Sign Language, and the sign for the Nimipu tribe is essentially, and William Clark took that as pierced noses. So Nez Perce is synonymous with Nimipu, but Nimipu is their self-recognized name. So I try to use it as much as possible. Any other questions?
Is the Nimipu tribe still in existence now? And if so, how many and where?
The Nimipu? Oh yes, they are very, very much so alive and well. I do not have exact numbers, but I do know that they still exist in their traditional homelands. Funny story, actually, I drove the Lewis and Clark Trail solo in 2019, and I was sitting at a Starbucks along the Columbia River, minding my business, and I looked out the window, and a marked truck that had a series of coolers in the back of it said Nimipu on the side. And of course, I knew right away what was going on. They worked with the fisheries department, and they were transporting salmon-related type things. So they are very, very much involved. There's a wonderful, wonderful cultural center. Gosh, I can't remember the name of the city, but it's there in Idaho, and it's where I got a lot of these pictures from that I took. And they run that cultural center, and so you can be sure that everything that's in it has been reviewed. So they are very, very much active still today. Sure. Any other questions?
I heard years ago that when the Nez Perce Minipu was going toward Canada, the United States government reached out to Canada to say, hey, do we have permission to come into your country to capture them if they make it there? Is there any, from Queen Victoria, is there any proof or evidence of that, or is it just all?
I personally have not found any evidence of it, so I can't speak on it definitively. But there was a lot of tension, so it would not be surprising to me if there was an attempt to do so. I'd be more surprised if they hadn't attempted, honestly, to go into Canada. But yeah, I can't speak definitively, unfortunately. Any other questions?
The statue of Sacagawea, alias Sacagawea,
Yes.
was that in Portland, Oregon?
I believe that one is, yes. It was.
Because there's a famous statue, looks just like that, in Portland, Oregon.
I think that is the Portland, Oregon
Yes.
one. Yeah, because it was raised in 1905, right after the suffragists started to pay attention to her in 1904, and they did pay for this statue as a result of renewing interest in her
Yeah.
story. So as far
Yeah.
as I know, that is the one.
No, it looks
Yeah.
like the one. And who called her Bird Woman?
Bird woman. So there's some complication with Sacagawea's name as to where it came from exactly. We do know that the correct pronunciation is Sacagawea or Sakakawea, based on the fact that William Clark was a terrible speller, and he spelled everything phonetically. So we do know that even though he couldn't say her name, he spelled it exactly like he heard it. So the bird woman is, I believe, what they thought was the Hidatsa meaning behind Sacagawea, because I believe it's, I want to say that the G sound doesn't exist in Shoshone. I'll have to review that exactly. But yeah, she was a captive of the Hidatsa tribe from her age of about 10 to 12 years old. She was captured, and it was most likely a Hidatsa name.
Yeah, and she was the one that really saved the Lewis and Clark expedition, right?
Well, so
Well,
she was
didn't she see her brother?
Kamehameha. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So when they got to the Shoshone camp, Kamehameha, they didn't recognize each other at first. So Chief Kamehameha, he was kind of weary. Lewis was actually the first one to arrive there, and they did not trust them because they saw that they had guns, and a lot of the enemies, they said that these guns that had stolen so much happiness from their tribe were with these white men. So they didn't trust them. So Lewis had to wait there in tension until Clark arrived and brought Sacagawea to them. Lewis had arrived and found them without any well-wishing partnership with Sacagawea. And so they did not trust him. But when Sacagawea arrived and started the translation, that's when she recognized Kamehameha as her long-lost brother. Just one of those coincidences of the expedition. And they actually had to put off council because Sacagawea was so emotionally overwhelmed. Lewis and Clark postponed council until she could collect herself.
Oh, my goodness.
So, and you got to remember, Sacagawea was about 16 years old. So, of course, she was thrilled to be not just back among her people, but to find out her brother was the chief. So yeah, it was one of those wonderful coincidences.
Yeah. And the last thing, Chief Joseph, there's a lot been written about Chief Joseph, right?
Yeah.
And what was his famous saying? I will not, something about peace.
I can't
Anyway,
remember. But yeah.
There's a lot written about Chief Joseph.
Oh yeah. He's one of the most researched Native Americans, I would say, not just in Namipu history, but in all of North American Native American history. There's a lot written about Chief Joseph. But yeah, I don't specialize in him, so I would not be able to quote him, unfortunately. But I know which one you're thinking of. I just can't remember it. Yes.
Just by your name, are you related to famous Clark, or is this a coincidence?
This comes up every time. Yes, I am related to William Clark. I did not know that when I started researching Lewis and Clark. So.
In what way? Well, what's your connection?
So I might have a few different connections to William Clark. We're actually exploring one of them that we just discovered last week. So I am still working on that connection in particular, I will say. So, and I actually discovered that possible connection while doing some final research for this program. So it was a very, very interesting find. But yes, I am related to William Clark. Any other questions?
Actually, it's kind of a comment and a question. Our daughter lives in Lander, Wyoming, which is just east of the Shoshone reservation there. And so I went and looked because there was a sign saying there was, I'm not going to say her name right, Sacagawea's grave. But you were saying there's some and my daughter too said there's controversy whether or not that's her grave or not.
Yes. So so William Clark was taking account of who had died when, where, several years after the expedition, and there was note taken that Sacagawea had died at a fort of putrid fever around the age of 25 years old. She would have had another child by then named Lisette. But unfortunately, this wife of Charbonneau that died at the fort was not named. So it could have been possibly Charbonneau's other wife, who was also Shoshone, and her name was Otterwoman. But we do not know which one of Charbonneau's wives died at the fort. It could have been Sacagawea. But according to Namipu tradition, she lived to a ripe old age on the Wind River Reservation. I'm not sure if we will ever know definitively what the fate of Sacagawea was, and perhaps it is best that way. I like to think that she escaped Charbonneau and lived to a ripe old age. I think that that is a much better story than dying at the age of 25 at a white man's fort. So perhaps it's best that we don't know. That I don't know. I could not find out what the fate of that dress was that she supposedly traded with Jane, daughter of Chief Timothy. But it could still be in possession of the tribe. So I'm not sure. It's fun to think about, though.
Do we know what happened to her children afterwards?
Yes, we do. So, William Clark appears a lot, again and again, if you look at the post-expedition years. So, William Clark asked them, the Charbonneaus, to allow him to educate Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, who would be known by William Clark as Little Pompey, the boy that was born at Fort Mandan. William Clark actually had him educated, and Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau did spend time actually in Europe, meeting all kinds of dignitaries, and eventually he would take part in the California Gold Rush. He was mildly successful, but he did run into trouble here and there, as one does when they are a little bit famous for the expedition. But yeah, William Clark officially, I believe, ended up adopting, if not both, definitely Jean-Baptiste, or Jean-Baptiste. So, and I think he is buried in California. So, yeah.
Did Clark ever know about daytime smoker?
I don't know, actually. I am wondering, actually, if when that council came to visit him in 1831, that Council of Four, that was sent by Chief Red Grizzly Bear, I would be curious to know if the reason that William Clark did not keep any record of that meeting was because having a Nimipu son would cause him considerable problems as the superintendent of the Indian Agency. It could have caused problems, so I'm wondering if perhaps that is the reason that he did not keep any notes of their visit. But I am not sure. If he did know about Daytime Smoker, he never acknowledged him. Any other questions? And Daytime Smoker is a very interesting character. I'm actually doing quite a bit of research on Daytime Smoker lately, so yeah. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you all very, very much. I appreciated meeting all of you.